Today is Monday, April 10th. It is 1 p.m., and this is panel 1512, Republicans, Who Are We Now? I'm Albert Hand. I didn't realize that there were this many Republicans in Boulder, Colorado. Right on. We have two producers today. Producers are here to keep order and to help you. I'll come to that in just a second. There's Randy Schultz. Randy, would you please raise your hand wherever you are? Okay, and the guy who just talked is the second producer, Gabe Sharuzzi. He raised his hand. We used to have microphones here for question and answers, and people would come up and they wouldn't ask questions for 5 minutes. And so we've done something new. We have an application, and I want to read you this statement. In this CWA session, we will utilize both the CWA app, which you can get on your iPhone or your iPad, and a note card system to receive questions from the audience. To ask a question in the app, simply select this session in the schedule, tap Live Q&A, and then insert your question. And your question will come up here and register on my iPad up here. You may also raise your hand at any time to request a note card and a pencil from one of our producers. That's particularly why I introduced the producers. Just raise your hand and they'll come and they'll give you a note card and a pencil. And when you've filled out the note card with your question, they'll pick it up and bring it up to me. If you are a student, please note this in your question because we do give priority to students' questions. And questioners who would like to verbalize their question and come up here can note this in the text, including your name, and if I select your question, I will recognize you and invite you to the microphone. If you are technologically challenged and don't yet know how to use the app, there's an information center in the lobby downstairs, and they can help you with your iPhone, iPad, whatever. We have about 80 minutes in this session. It will be split in three. There will be about 25 minutes opening statements from our panelists, our three panelists here, and 25 minutes of discussion amongst the panelists, and then 25 minutes or so is reserved for questions from the audience. We probably won't be able to answer or to honor all of the questions, so if you submit a question and your question isn't selected, it's just because there are too many questions. But our panelists have agreed after the session is concluded, they will be in the lobby outside, and if you want to talk with them afterwards, fine. What we want to do when the session is over is clear this room because there will be another panel later on. I want to introduce the panelists. Their full biographies are in the program. We are honored to have them. They are all conservatives. They are all Republicans. And we, for this session, are in very good hands. On the far left over there is Michael Frank. He's a longtime CWA panelist. He's a fellow at the Hoover Institute. He's the director of its DC programs. He was formerly with the Heritage Foundation and was a policy director for Majority Leader Kevin McCarthy. Next to him is Guy Benson. Guy Benson is political editor of Town Hall Inc. He's a frequent guest and conservative voice on radio and TV. I'm a fan of his. He is a frequent panelist on Fox News, which I watch every day. And he's very balanced, fair and even, okay? He also has a book, End of Discussion, which you can purchase in the bookstore downstairs. And on my far right here is Robert Kaufman. Robert, you picked up on it, right? Okay, I'll wait. Bob is also a longtime panelist at CWA. And in the context of this panel about republicanism, all you need to know about Bob is the title of his newest book, which is Dangerous Doctrine: How Obama's Grand Strategy Weakened America. No booing. Also, I want to announce, you may know this already, but Bob has been selected. Bob comes once a year to CWA, but we're going to have the privilege of having him with us here in Boulder for the entire year this next year, because he has, very good. He is the, will be for the 2017-2018 academic year, the visiting professor in conservative thought and policy here at CU.
God help you.
Okay, as I said, there were about 25 minutes or so allocated to opening statements. Michael, do you want to start?
Sure. Hello, everybody. It's great to be back in Boulder. It's another beautiful day. Future of the Republican Party. I think if I were given on the same panel a year ago, which I think we did have one of these panels a year ago, I'm afraid to see what I said and how it has stacked up against what actually has transpired. Let me lay out a few things. One is that in some ways what happened on November 8th, demographically and so on in the election, was predictable. And something I personally had been writing about on and off for about 10 years. That the person who would embody that would be Donald Trump is not something I ever would have imagined. But what I've seen happening, and I'll talk about this maybe sort of from a bottom-up perspective with respect to the House of Representatives, which is my place of greatest interest and experience, by talking about congressional districts and how they pan out and kind of what the makeup is of some of the districts and how it has shown a pattern going back. First time I noticed it was after the '06 election, but I think it was already in process before then. And that is that the Republican Party has increasingly become a party that relies upon large numbers of votes from folks who are in the middle of a number of kind of different measures. So by income, by level of educational attainment, even things like the median home value in a congressional district, what you find is that when you find regions that are at the top end of those kind of measures, i.e. they have the heaviest concentration of people with graduate degrees in households. They have the most households with incomes of $200,000 or greater, which is the top breakpoint for the census data. Or where the median home values are, what I found was basically $275,000 or greater. You have something like 2/3 to 3/4 of those seats that fit those profiles at the highest end in Democratic hands. But it's also true that at the bottom end of those distributions, the Democrats do disproportionately well as well. So you have basically a top-bottom coalition. You have a lot of congressional seats that have significant numbers of people who are very low income, very low in the educational attainment measure. They tend to rent, not own. But you also have in those same areas a lot of wealthy constituencies that do very, very well. And there's something about that mixture that leads, more often than not, and by a pretty big margin, especially compared to the number of the percentage of Democratic seats in the House the last few cycles, which is low to mid-40s. I think it's maybe 44% now. It was 43% in the last Congress. They tend to perform, 20, 25, 30 percentage points higher than those those numbers than their regular share. And the same is true in the other direction for the Republicans. So if you got to know some of these members, you'd see that. A lot of the Republican members come from places where, the biggest question about their vacation is which lake are we taking the RV to, or where are we going to do the campsite this year? They don't have fancy vacation as destinations, if indeed they have vacations. They tend to run small businesses and they work 60, 70 hours a week. They have a different kind of, the communities are very different in their profile. And that's where that tends to be their sweet spot. Well, guess what? It also was Donald Trump's sweet spot, November 8th. And if you look at things like the districts with the most highest number of graduate degrees in households, I think of the top 100 of those districts, 77 were won by Hillary Clinton. And at the other end, a very comfortable majority of those 100 at the bottom, with the least, smallest number of people with graduate degrees, was won by Donald Trump. And you can do that across all those measures. And it's a profile. It's just sort of where the two parties have gone. And you go home to, and one other thing, for example, is economic inequality. They call it a Gini coefficient measure. Census does it. And of the 50 districts with the greatest level of economic inequality, 42 last Congress were in Democratic hands. I think the number went up a little bit after this election. If you look at the kind of a lot of people pay attention, commentators pay attention to congressional seats where a Republican seat went for the Democratic candidate or vice versa. Well, when you look at that, the kind of Republican seats that went for Hillary Clinton, I think there were about 24 of them, were either people like Barbara Comstock in suburban Virginia, or Peter Roskam in suburban Chicago, or even, interestingly enough, Congressman Yoder in suburban Kansas City, or some of those kinds of districts that are basically full of affluent, well-educated constituents. They can send a Republican to Congress, but the district itself went to Hillary Clinton. John Culberson in suburban Houston, Pete Sessions in suburban Dallas, two more examples of that, where the district actually went for Secretary Clinton. And the other kind of district where Republican seats went for Clinton were districts with a lot of Hispanic voters with very, very low socioeconomic profiles. Will Hurd in border area of Texas, or some of the Cuban members from the Miami metro area, and one or two others like that. And the Democratic seats that went for Donald Trump, and there were about a dozen or so of those, were largely like three in rural Minnesota. One of them went by 30+ points for Donald Trump. And so they were districts that were basically profiled with very, very few of sort of the elite measures I was talking about, and they went for Trump. So Trump clearly had this kind of middle to lower middle kind of a base that he was able to profit from. And so what does that mean for the Republican Party going forward? I think it's, given that it's been going on for a while, you can maybe be tempted to say not a whole lot, but I think what Trump's going to do is shuffle the ideological deck quite a bit. And there's a lot of things you probably could think of what I'm about to say here, whether it's on immigration, whether it's on trade-related issues. I think you can see in some other areas, mainly, one thing I think Trump may try to do is push a lot of policies designed to appeal to the private sector trade union constituencies. And it wouldn't surprise me at all if you'd see the AFL-CIO have some pretty serious internal discussions about who to be supporting going forward if Trump starts to deliver, whether it's an infrastructure bill, he approved those pipelines, he's approving a lot of the kind of things that the trade union rank and file wants to see start to happen so they can have jobs and things to do. And I think that that's the nature of how he wants to operate. And he's not going to be as purely ideological as previous Republican presidents going back to Reagan. I think he's going to be very, have situational ethics, a situational ideology. And so that's going to cause, a lot of people who have grown up and gotten used to a Ronald Reagan style, Jack Kemp style Republican Party to think a lot and think twice about this. But he's also going to give other kinds of voters a different perspective on what it may mean to be a Republican. So I think shuffling this deck is going to be kind of the watchword as we go forward. I think it's going to show up in statewide elections. It's going to show up in the local level elections. There's still quite a few seats in the state legislative side of things that have yet to be sorted out the way they have been over the last ongoing 20 to 25 years. So that's kind of the big picture view, and I look forward to your questions as we kind of get into what does this mean issue by issue by issue. But what you're going to end up with are a lot of people having to make kind of, on the one hand, on the other hand, sort of judgments about how they feel about this guy and how they feel about the policies he's going to be moving forward on. And to some extent, you could look at the things he's done thus far and say that almost any of the 17 other Republican candidates, if they had become president, would have been doing many of the same type of things during these first, 70 or 80 days. But there'll be moments when Trump will want to do a few things that would be, very much against Ronald Reagan's doctrines of this or that. The free market people are going to start, hitting the fainting couches, I think, on a lot of things. And some of the things that you might actually, if it weren't Trump doing, you might actually like.
Okay, Guy,
So-
could you pick up on that?
What's that?
Guy?
Just in general?
Yeah.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah.
So, it was funny, before the panel, thanks for having me back, by the way, tepid applause, that's about right. My Hauser asked, okay, so they're sort of moderate Democrats. I said, who are you guys, actually, at dinner last night? Who is the Republican Party? And my only answer was, we are very tremendous. We are classier than ever, believe me. And beyond that, I didn't really know how to answer the question, because it's a confusing time to be a conservative. I think there's a paradox here, a very real one, which is, on one hand, the Republican Party is an electorally dominant ruling party in America today, and I can run through some of the numbers momentarily, but I think we're also a party whose base and sort of the conservative movement is roiled in an identity crisis, and that faces significant challenges moving forward. So I'd start with kind of where we currently stand as a Republican Party electorally. On paper, in very, very good shape, right? So the Republicans control the presidency, the United States Senate, the United States House of Representatives, and their grasp on power is even firmer in the states. Over the course of the Obama years, the Republicans gained at the state and federal level about 1,000 legislative seats nationwide, which is an astounding number. In the states, Republicans control about 2/3 of the governorships in the country, and in state legislatures, there are 98 of them in the country that are partisan bodies. The one exception being in Nebraska, they have a unicameral, nonpartisan legislature there, but it's basically controlled by the Republicans, in effect, even if not officially. But of the 98 legislative bodies in the rest of the country, 68 of them are controlled by Republicans. I mean, it's remarkable, that level of dominance. House Republicans, we hear a lot about popular votes from our friends on the left, and I understand why that's the case, but the other national popular vote was in the House of Representatives, and the Republicans won that by 7 figures. It was a comfortable victory. And what's been interesting to see is, since Trump's election, there's been obviously a lot of turmoil, a lot of people who aren't happy, the resistance, the protests, social media abuzz, and there have been 5 special elections since Trump's victory for state legislative seats, 4 of which I believe were in blue states. And there was a real concerted effort on the left to pour money and get active in these races and to try to flip, in these special elections, flip a seat from Republican to Democrat and sort of say, this is the tide turning. And so far, in those first 5, Democrats have gone 0 for 5. Those have all been held by the Republicans. In fact, the only seat to change hands went in the opposite direction, a seat in Louisiana where a Democrat left office and a Republican won that seat. So I think the actual results that the resistance is looking for have yet to materialize, but hold that thought. There's going to be an interesting congressional race in Georgia next week. There'll probably be a runoff a number of weeks later, but that's Tom Price's seat, the current HHS secretary. A Republican district, not a very Trump-friendly district. The Democrats have recruited a young guy about my age who has been fundraising very well, mostly from out of state, but Democrats are really focusing on that seat. If that's an upset for the Dems in the 6th district of Georgia next week or in the runoff, I think that's a signal that potentially a 2010 type wave in the opposite direction might be building. If not, we should kind of wait and see. Speaking of 2018, I think if we're going to make any predictions, which seem crazy these days, you're just guaranteed to make a fool of yourself making predictions about American politics. But I would put pretty good money that Democrats are likely to gain in the House of Representatives. Whether they're going to have enough to retake the House, that's a tough climb. It's doable depending on how unpopular or popular the president is. I think just given the sheer numbers of seats Republicans have won at the governor level and the state legislative level, the Democrats have nowhere to go but up. I really don't think they can bottom out at those levels any more than they have. So there'll be gains there as well. And then the U.S. Senate, I think, is a weird anomaly because typically you would say, given dynamics, let's say Trump is relatively unpopular and the American public isn't particularly pleased with the way things are going in Washington, you would guess in a 52-48 Senate, Democrats would be poised relatively easily to take back the upper chamber in Congress. But just the way the calendar is falling, every third seat is up every 6 years, or every 2 years rather, right? So they're 6-year terms. And the way it happens to be is that in 2018, it is an extremely, extremely difficult map for Democrats, where I think even if the Republicans aren't popular nationally, they could still just sort of accidentally gain seats in the Senate because of the seats that are up, 10 of them are held currently by Democrats who represent states Donald Trump won. And 5 of those 10 represent states that Donald Trump won by 19 points or more. So, and the vulnerable Republicans are few and far between. Dean Heller maybe in Nevada, maybe Jeff Flake in Arizona. So at the moment, the Team Red is doing very, very well. On the other hand, I would say the recent debacle over the health care bill is illustrative of the problem that the Republicans face, which is we don't really know who we are ideologically. We have some serious rifts within the party where Republicans run for 7 years straight. It's like one of the only things they could all say together, which was repeal and replace Obamacare. Every Republican was on board for that. And then, all right, guys, you've got everything. Let's go. And the whole thing crashes and burns because you have the Freedom Caucus over here and the president tweeting about how they need to get primaried next time and Paul Ryan tearing his hair out. He has great hair, though. He really does. So that was a portrait in dysfunction, and we'll see if they can get their act together over the next year. And I would also say, and this is a note of caution that I often share with my conservative friends who look at a map that looks painted very red right now, just remind them that demography was not destiny or dispositive yet, but I also think that moving forward, generationally speaking, the Republican Party is going to have to look different moving forward if it's going to want to meet with success in the future among an increasingly non-white electorate and among people my age. The last point I will make is when people say, okay, well, how do you view yourself as a Republican? And I've always considered myself more of a conservative than a Republican. The Republican Party is just an avenue to, in my view, get better policy outcomes than if the other side won. But it's confusing because I did not vote for this president. I didn't vote for his opponent. I felt sort of like a nomad, sort of this homeless, ideologically homeless person in the 2016 election. And the way I think of it is the parties, and this is crude and there's cross-pollination, it's not perfect, but the party is kind of in 4 buckets overall right now. You have sort of the Trumpian bucket, populist, not necessarily wedded to any sort of deep ideological conservatism. Populist, I think, is a fair way of putting it, and the person who most embodies that is the president himself. Another group, the second group I would refer to, loosely speaking, as the true conservatives. Sort of the person at the front of this line would be maybe a Ted Cruz type character, very ideologically conservative. House Freedom Caucus would probably fall in this category as well. The third group would be sort of the definitely conservative, like mainstream conservative, expand the party mentality, maybe like a Marco Rubio type character. And again, I'm speaking with a broad brush. And then finally, there is an establishment part of the party as well. Jeb Bush was sort of the poster child for that, and didn't go very well for poor old Jeb in 2016. But there is a constituency there, and there's a large number of people in that realm in Washington, D.C. and the Beltway as well, and they're not going anywhere. So the degree to which those four groups can work together, agree on any sort of real governing philosophy I think remains to be seen. Because the supposed layup of repealing Obamacare, turned into a brick right out of the gate, and I'm not sure there's a viable path forward yet on that particular issue. That's sort of, to me, an acid test of whether these groups can come together to do much of anything productive at all. So I'll leave it at that for now, and look forward to many questions from all of our fellow Republicans.
And in the election of 2016, it's a watershed because both parties rejected their political establishments. The Bushes are now political history. And had Hillary Clinton not been an iconic candidate, first woman to be, Bernie Sanders, who I know from Vermont, one of the most disagreeable, boring, angry human beings I've ever met, someone who makes Hillary Clinton look charming by comparison, not an easy feat. Bernie Sanders would have won the nomination. So we are in a polarized electorate where both parties have rejected their political establishments. So this is absolutely new terrain. And for Republicans in general and conservatives in particular, this is a gamble. This is a disquieting time. We've elected a candidate who has voted for the Republican Party exactly once, for himself. And in talking about the new coalition that Trump has created or may create, one of the imponderables is the unpredictability of President Trump's political trajectory. We don't really know for sure what's coming next because he does not approach the office, for better or worse, some would say for better, with the sense of deep ideological convictions that you would associate with the mainstream Republican candidates since Ronald Reagan in 1980. Some of that could be good. He began, in my view, very disturbingly talking the language of Charles Lindbergh, evoking America first, seeming to suggest that we were going to repudiate our role as the world's default power. Some of his initial choices for national security people, very inappropriate. General Flynn and Steve Bannon and the National Security Council seemed to confirm the worst instincts of conservative internationalists. And yet on that issue, I think there's some very positive evidence. Getting rid of Bannon, choosing McMaster as Flynn's replacement, choosing the rock-solid warrior scholar James Mattis as Secretary of Defense. There's also optimistic evidence that Trump has a learning curve and is not repudiating, but maybe modifying or tempering the traditional vigilant internationalism of the Republican Party that served the country so well. We don't really know for sure. I think Guy's right and Mike's right that if you take a snapshot right now, things look good. I think it's a little more fragile than that. I really think it depends on whether Trump succeeds or not in generating significant economic growth. He did something that was, I think, politically imprudent, but he may get away with it. He set very high expectations. Unlike Reagan in the 1981 inaugural address, who said, we're going to get out of this, but we didn't get into it in a day, and it's going to take a long, hard work and some disappointment, but we'll prevail eventually. Trump said, we're terrible, but it's going to be beautiful as soon as he becomes president. We're going to pass health care on the first day. So when you set expectations that high, you're going to be judged by the expectations you create. The Republican presidential coalition is also much more fragile, that despite the shock of Hillary Clinton losing, which I must say I enjoyed tremendously, Republicans shouldn't gloat. This is a very fragile victory. If 38,700 votes had gone the other way in 4 or 5 states, Hillary Clinton would have been president of the United States. Also, the long-term demographics on current trajectories at the presidential level, in my view, favor the Democratic Party unless, as Guy puts it, the Republicans do a better job making their case to Hispanics and young people, the swing vote for the next several elections. Things that Republicans gloss over, but they ought to notice, is that many heretofore solid red states have become contested. Include Georgia in that category. In the next 3 or 4 election cycles, Texas, without which Republicans don't have a chance for a presidential election, may move to be a contested state. If you look at the demographics of the country, it's very hard to come up with the numbers where Republicans win the presidency without shaving significantly Democrats winning 80% of the Hispanic vote. I think that the Republican Party has a great opportunity to make inroads with Hispanics. Many Republican candidates, from Jeb Bush to John McCain to Rick Perry, have. But on that issue, I think that the Republicans are going to have to handle, as we have not, the immigration question very carefully. Because if you convey to Hispanics that you're the know-nothing party and you don't like Hispanics for where they came from, as opposed from making the legitimate distinction between legal and illegal immigration, assimilation and multiculturalism, if we don't convey that we are a country of immigrants that welcome legal immigrants who want to become American, I think that's not only bad ethics, but I think that will spell, if not doom, bleak times for Republicans at the electoral level. A lot of this is going to depend literally on whether this works. If you want to be optimistic on the conservative side, Trump's Supreme Court Justice nominee, energy policy, his commitment to rebuild America's defenses that Obama has ravaged, all bode well and suggest a greater degree of continuity with the most successful policies of the Republican Party. But as Mike pointed out, because Trump does not have deep fixed ideological positions, to say the least, he is more transactional or expedient. Conservatives ought to worry about any president that they have elected who not only voted Republican the first time only for himself, but his seminal academic / policy work is the art of making a deal. That means that for President Trump, in many ways, the deal may be more important than the substance of the deal. I hope not, but conservatives have to hold him to account, or otherwise Donald Trump will prove to be the Pied Piper of the conservative movement. Thank you.
Thank all 3 of you. This is the part of the program where you 3 get to play amongst yourselves. I want to start that off by saying that each of you has said in one way or another that the party's not going to be as ideological, that the party must change, that things are fragile. To pinpoint that, can Trump get along with the Freedom Caucus? And if he can't, do you think he's going to reach out to Democrats? Where do you see this going?
I think he, like I said earlier, I do think he has the potential to pick up a lot of support among the trade union, blue-collar constituency out there that historically has been part of the AFL-CIO's kind of part of that blue wall for whoever the Democratic candidate happens to be. And what that would require is doing a lot of things and pushing a lot of policies that the Freedom Caucus would find abhorrent. So I think if the Freedom Caucus can't figure out a way to work with Trump anytime soon, they're going to start seeing him move in a different direction to get to majorities in the House and the Senate. And I think that would look at the infrastructure bill as it starts to move. $1 trillion, 10 years. What types of policies would be embedded in it? You know, do you waive all the environmental reviews for different projects? You know, there's a whole bunch of things that can be set in there that might really be attractive to those groups. And that's a pretty good constituency for him to pick up, and it would cause because they have a lot of resources disproportionate to their numbers. And I think that's an example, but I don't see the Freedom Caucus anytime soon collapsing. I think those guys have a very purist point of view, and one of the problems they tend to run into in a legislative body is they don't know how to get to yes in any kind. They know what they're against and not so much what they're in favor of, and that's been a pattern for years now.
And the Republican Party's dilemma is not just Trump, but it's also some of the constituent parts, particularly the Freedom Caucus. Again, they talk in the name of Reagan, but they ignore Reagan's central adage, except on existential issues. Reagan always said that it's better to get 70 or 80% and establish a gravitational pull for success than all or nothing. Mike says that the Freedom Caucus doesn't know how to get to yes. I agree with that, and there are times I wonder whether they care about getting to yes, that they would rather lose than get 70 or 80%, and they're much more comfortable in opposition than taking the responsibility of government, which is in most cases reconciling the desirable and the possible. So to be fair to Trump, he has a very difficult set of political conditions to try to convince the Freedom Caucus that he's the only let me give you a prime example, and my panelists may disagree. The Freedom Caucus is theoretically pure on health care not covering pre-existing condition. Now, leaving aside the social equity of that, it's insane to think that any replacement health care bill that has a chance to get through in any time certain to be appropriately beneficial for a political election cycle, you're not going to get a perfect health care bill. And whether or not you get pre-existing condition, Aristotle said the mark of intelligence is to make reasonable political distinctions. Pre-existing condition is not the equivalent of appeasing Hitler at Munich. We can live with pre-existing condition and still retain our honor intact. I think the conservative caucus has a problem with that notion.
I think also, though, there's another side to that coin of the challenge for Trump, because some people say, well, if the House Freedom Caucus won't play ball, he'll just move over here to the center and get some Democrats. There are strong incentives for Democrats not to cooperate with him at all on anything, with a lot of people in the base saying, you will resist at every turn anything this man wants to do, or else you're collaborating with someone that, you know, we view as, you know, an incipient dictator or whatever. So I don't think it's that easy for him to just say, oh, I'll just move over here and try to win Democrats, even though some of his top advisors, his daughter and son-in-law, are liberal Democrats, and he himself was a liberal Democrat for virtually his entire adult life. It's a very weird political dynamic in Washington right now, more so than usual. The other thing I would say in Trump's defense on this healthcare process that we've seen, again, this is why I think so many predictions have just turned out to be wrong. The rap on Trump was he doesn't care really about policy at all. He doesn't really care about healthcare aside from a talking point. He wants to get to other stuff instead. The degree to which, because I've been in touch with members on the Hill, I've been in good contact frequently with the Ryan people in leadership, the degree to which he rolled up his sleeves and really worked much harder than I thought he ever would on that bill, and continues to try to revive it, sending Mike Pence as his point man down there, really holding multiple meetings with the Freedom Caucus, but also their moderate counterparts, the Tuesday Group, is sort of centrist Republicans. He was on Capitol Hill. He was bringing people to the White House, and that process of cajoling and compromise is ongoing. And I was talking to the speaker two weeks ago, a week and a half ago, and he said Trump very quickly figured out what the dynamics were within the caucus and what the challenges were and who was acting in good faith and who might not be, and is adjusting accordingly. So he is someone who is not my cup of tea in a lot of ways, but there is something intuitive about Donald Trump as a political actor that I think people who underestimate him really miss the boat. He's an intuitive actor who sometimes gets things comically or frighteningly wrong, but he also he hits on things. He puts his finger on a pulse that most politicians miss, and I think that's part of that magic secret sauce that somehow led him to easily win the Republican nomination, and then also win the presidency. Has he ever mentioned his margin of electoral college victory? I think 306 is the biggest ever. Like, well, that's not true. It's like many people are saying it was the biggest ever. Biggest crowd ever at an inauguration. Anything else you hear is fake news. So sad. So sad. On a separate note, I want to ask what you guys think of this, because I think we're right to raise the alarm and to have all the caveats about the future and how things are challenging and how everything's fragile and the coalition is tough with demographics. On the other hand, in the 2016 elections, yes, Trump won. If you look at all of the battleground states where there were also Senate races, which was most of them, in all of them except one, Missouri, in every other case, the Republican senator or Senate candidate ran ahead of Trump, in many cases well ahead of Trump, where you could make an argument with those case studies that sort of a traditional Republicanism or a traditional conservatism, while it has struggled to win the presidency and while Trump brought more people, different people into the fold, that traditional Republicanism outperformed him. So are we overestimating the fragility here?
Well, I actually have a related point. The greatest asset that the Republicans have now, honestly, is the opposition. That if the Democratic Party, as it looks to be, makes the conclusion that the mistake of 2016 was not being ideologically to the left enough, and someone like Elizabeth Warren is the face of the future, this is going to reinforce, in my view, all those trends that were very positive for the Republicans at the senatorial level. I also think, Guy, that had the Republicans run someone like Marco Rubio, I know people disagree, they would have won this going away. It's very difficult, I think, to generalize from this election because we had Andrew Dice Clay in a suit running against Lady Macbeth. we had two very flawed, polarizing, unpopular candidates who really needed each other. They were codependents because they were the only candidates that the other one could probably have beaten in a general election. So that's a caveat for that.
Let me just, one separate point. When Bob talked about Republicans and Hispanics, I'll just put one thing on the table and think about it. In July last year, the Pew Hispanic Center did a poll of Hispanics. And one of the questions was, who do you support, Clinton or Trump? And they divided the sample into two categories of Hispanics, English dominant and Spanish dominant. Spanish dominant, Secretary Clinton had something like a 68 to 26 margin over Trump. Among English dominant Hispanics, it was much smaller, it was 48-41. And if that's any indication of maybe as Hispanics assimilate and become, English speakers and second generation, third generation Americans, and there's intermarriage and so on, maybe the Hispanic trajectory of assimilation will be a lot like Italians and Irish and groups that came before. And if that's true, and if that number has any indication of that, then time will be on the Republican side as far as the Hispanics go. And they may wake up one day. I mean, my suspicion is today Italians are either going to be slightly more Republican than not, or within a margin of error, whereas there was a time when that was viewed as a difficult hurdle. Same with the Irish, right? And the ethnic groups used to divide up that way. Well, maybe the Hispanic assimilation one day will lead to there being a 55-45 kind of a split that's going to be politically less significant than if it remains 75-25.
And you mentioned the Hispanic question, and you mentioned Marco Rubio, and to put my cards on the table, I like Rubio a lot. I have some disagreements with him ideologically. I think he's a little hawkish for my taste, but probably not for your taste.
He's a dove for me.
But I don't even know where to go with that one. But if you look at what he did in Florida in 2016, it really was remarkable, right? So the Democrats got their hand-picked nominee, Patrick Murphy, to run for that seat. The Republicans begged Rubio, once he bowed out of the presidential race, to come back and run for the Senate seat, and he said, okay, fine. He ended up winning. He was the #1 vote getter across all races in Florida by a long shot. He won that race by 8 or 9 points, which is really a tough thing to do in a state like Florida, where Donald Trump won by 1 point, where Barack Obama won by 1 point in 2012. Rubio won by Florida standards very comfortably. And he did so by winning women outright, okay, by virtually tying among Hispanics. And partially that was because the Cuban-American population went heavily for him, but he also was pretty competitive among other Hispanics, including a pretty large Puerto Rican community in the state of Florida. Rubio won, don't quote me exactly on the statistics, but about 20% of black women and about 1/4 of black men. Those are extraordinarily good numbers for any Republican. And he was competitive among younger voters. He won the older cohort of millennials outright. And so it shows you that candidates can matter. Rubio is, fluently bilingual. And there was one example, I sort of did a bit of a deep dive into his campaign. He won a majority black precinct in the Jacksonville, Florida area because there had been an issue with a slumlord treating people terribly and unfairly, and Rubio seriously was upset by it, went there repeatedly, made it an issue, and fought on behalf of that community. And wouldn't you know it, he won that precinct, which is something that is unheard of for a Republican to do. So I'm not saying that Rubio embodies the future, but I think that he's a very different type of Republican, certainly than Donald Trump is, and in a very large, populous, diverse swing state, he performed marvelously well. So I think you can look at worrisome signs, which we've talked about, and we shouldn't turn a blind eye to them, but I think you can also show candidate quality, and the way you approach the electorate really does matter and can shift elections significantly.
But if you become known as the party of the wall, you can affect that dynamic. You can't. I agree that Republicans have a great deal of potential, not pandering, but making the case to Hispanics and young people why conservative principles should appeal to them. If, however, the Republican Party defines itself or is defined as being anti-immigrant, that's going to impede the chance of the Rubios either winning the nomination or taking advantage of.
Well, so that's you alienate alienate people.
And I think the jury's still out on where the Republican Party's going to go on that, and it's very dangerous.
And just speaking as a younger person as well, who really struggles, because I'm thrilled with Neil Gorsuch, for example, but I'm having Donald Trump as the president. This is someone who attacked a Hispanic judge for his ethnic background, saying he couldn't do his job because of his ethnic background. He's someone who showed shocking lack of grace with a Gold Star Muslim family, right? Someone who said on tape that you just grab women by the genitals, and it just, we're like, all right, we're going to vote for that person. And I wonder how much of that taint sticks on the party lastingly for younger voters, or do people say Trump is this sui generis, bizarre phenomenon who is not really a Republican or a Democrat, and 10 years from now, voters in my age group, or groups where Republicans have to do better, say, all right, Trump's in the rearview mirror, he did some things well, some things less well, and it doesn't stick. The stench of that stuff doesn't linger. I don't know. I think that's an open question and a very important question.
Do you want to respond to that, Bob? Or I wish all of you could see the questions that you have have asked. I think that we ought to put like a screen up here, and you'll get kind of a flavor of the thought processes that are going on amongst you all. I'm going to conflate. I'm just going to. It's kind of throwing some raw meat out there for you guys. Conflate a couple of them because this is a theme, and address it. I'm a student. When and what law will Trump break first? I ask this because that event seems inevitable, and that was posed by a student. And another one, sort of in the same vein, is how can Republicans support anti-American practices such as voter suppression, denial of civil rights, and denying a Supreme Court selection? I've honored a number of questions in that, so, okay.
Yeah,
Bob?
Well, none of that is so. It's, well, let me give you the example. The people have misused history. I'm a historian. Trump's a fascist. This is ridiculous. You may not like Trump. If Trump is a fascist, he's a very ineffective one. Think of this. 2 judges have struck down his immigration plan. What did Trump do? He didn't march on Washington. There were not brown shirts in the street. He agreed. No, don't say give him time. There's no evidence of that at all. The health care bill didn't go through. There is no plausible evidence whatsoever. The plausible evidence for Trump not being respectful of the rule of law is about the same as the evidence of Obama being born in Kenya. It doesn't exist. You may not like Trump, but you discredit your case when you make him into something he's not. You may not agree with him, but he has so far, by every act, suggested that he respects the constitutional process. And as for voter suppression, it's in the eyes of the beholder. A lot of the complaints about people voting who shouldn't have been voting on the other side, Trump's claim that the election, people were trying to subvert the election, aren't plausible, and the claims that Trump stole the election aren't plausible. Democrats have a problem with this, and this is why people like me roll their eyes whenever the Democrats complain. Since 1968, every Republican victory, Democrats have not conceded. They lost. Nixon, it was the secret plan to end the war. 72, Nixon, Watergate. 1980, Reagan manipulates Iran-Contra. 1988, William Lee Horton. 2000, Bush v. Gore. Come on. Admit on occasion you lost. We won. And there's no plausible evidence, even if you don't like the outcome, that this was not a fair and legitimate outcome. And for all of Donald Trump's limitations, and I've written about them, he is in no way anything close to being a fascist or threatening the rule of law. That just isn't so. It's hyperbole.
I would say someone shouted out that Trump lies. Yes, he lies a lot, effortlessly, intentionally or otherwise. Now, he also ran against a fellow world-class liar. They were trying to outlie each other, and I guess he won, or I don't know, I'm not sure. Did he win or lose? In terms of the question of which law is he going to break or whatever, one thing that at least concerns me that is worth keeping an eye on is conflicts of interest with his family. It's very shady to me, some of the stuff that's going on, and unclear what these lines are. We now have his daughter and her husband both in the White House with official government positions. So that attaches to itself some ethics laws that need to be followed. Now, I happen to think that Ivanka is a conscientious person who doesn't want to violate the law. I also think it's really weird when you have Kellyanne Conway, like, plugging her Nordstrom's line of products or whatever from the White House. That's unusual, to put it one way. So the conflicts of interest thing and the sons, what exactly is their role? To what extent are they in on these meetings with foreign leaders when there's potential business in those countries for Trump Inc.? I hope the White House lawyers are keeping a very close eye on that. As for sort of the list of horribles, the parade of horribles about the Republicans, one of the big examples of voter suppression that we hear about all the time are voter ID laws. And, I understand that's sort of a popular talking point on the left, but the fact of the matter is every single poll on the question shows 3/4 support of the American people for voter ID laws, including overwhelming support among people of color. So, I mean, you have to, now there are certain, schemes that have been put out by both parties in gerrymandering, that sort of thing, that seem to be targeted towards certain demographics. But when it comes to voter integrity laws, voter ID laws, I mean, I really think that that's an unfair smear. And the last point I would make, someone mentioned the Supreme Court vacancy, and I could talk for an hour about this one. But the fact of the matter is that President Clinton and President Obama both got their first 2 Supreme Court picks through overwhelmingly no Republican attempted filibuster. With the Garland nomination towards the end, that, I think, was the denouement of decades of partisan escalations in the confirmation wars, where the vast majority of those escalations were done at the hands of the Democrats. And in fact, Tom Daschle, in an interview just yesterday, said our hands, Democrats' hands, are far dirtier than the Republicans on this. So Mitch McConnell took a big risk, a big political gamble. He said, we're not going to fill this seat. And by the way, there's precedent for that. There have been long vacancies in Supreme Court history, much longer than the Garland vacancy, where he said, all right, if Trump wins, we're going to make this an issue in the campaign. If Trump wins, we're going to replace Scalia with a conservative. If we lose, Hillary Clinton's president, she'll probably withdraw Garland, put a harder core liberal in there, and they'll nuke the filibuster again, which is what the Republicans ended up doing. It was not the Garland seat. It was an open seat. Republicans finally played hardball the way the Democrats always do on these things. They won the election, and they put in an exemplary candidate. Democrats escalated again with an unprecedented filibuster, and Republicans did what they had to do. So more power to Mitch McConnell.
Just real quick, Guy mentioned the voter suppression and referred to gerrymandering. One point to bear in mind on gerrymandering is that the history of gerrymandering for the last 40 plus years, race is a big component of that because the court has said it has to be a component of that. So one little tidbit is that going through at least into the 90s, I haven't checked this in the last number of cases, but every Supreme Court case involving the Voting Rights Act had on the same side the Republican National Committee and the NAACP. Okay, they both had a similar interest. And the racial considerations have evolved in ways that reflect a desired outcome. So from a requirement to have majority-minority districts sufficient to represent minority voices in the electorate, there's a new theory that's emerged called majority influence districts, which can be lower than the majority, but some kind of a magical threshold that some social scientist conjures up that says if you have this percentage now, maybe it's 25 or 35%, then that's going to be okay. So there's this sort of, these numbers games going on. But race is a component because the courts have inflicted it on that whole process. Would it be that way anyway? Maybe. But that's a function of block voting. And one thing that you also want to bear in mind, and it's kind of nasty and scary in my view, 69% of whites nationwide who do not have a college degree voted for Trump. That's an astounding number if you think about it. Okay, that's block voting. That's identity politics turned on its head and moving in a different direction with a really big group of people who are starting to see each other as having common interest and voting in a common way. If that gains traction, and you're only a few percentage points away from where the Democrats are with Hispanics, for example, and Asians, you can imagine that fundamentally changing our body politic and elections for a pretty long time. It's a, beware you get what you ask for. And the Republicans have always been kind of hesitant and immune and scared of engaging in identity politics. Well, I think what might have happened is it happened for them. Trump has no such inhibitions. He loves it, and he profited from that. So, when you play that game, the Frankenstein's monster can turn around and start chasing you. So, I think that's partly what happened Election Day.
I want to pick up on that because, again, I'm conflating some questions, but several of you have noted that this is a panel on Republicanism, that you have 4 Republicans sitting up here, and that they are all white males. I should also point out, for what it's worth, that this audience is way predominantly white. But the questions are, well, that's bolder. The questions are, one, from a student. I'm a black student here. Do you believe Black Lives Matter? If this is a sentence you struggle to or refuse to say, why is that? Another sort of related one is considering the white men sitting on stage representing this question, can you speak to how important issues of inclusivity and diversity factor into where you're at now? And I would just add, you've seen some inklings from Trump that the real problems in the inner cities with blacks and lawlessness and whatever are primarily cities that have had for almost centuries have been controlled by Democrats. And Trump has given some indication that he might want to jump into that and construct policies that appeal to blacks. So I just put that on the table and see where you guys take it.
All lives matter. I don't care about diversity. I care about excellence based on merit. And I don't have one iota of guilt because I come from a minority that has been discriminated against for thousands of years every place. And I've never appealed for that. All I want to be judged by, to quote the great Martin Luther King, for better or worse, judge me by the content of my character, for better or worse. That's where I stand. I can do no other.
And I would add that every time a conservative or Republican is advocating for policies like school choice, fixing the Head Start program, which is a disaster for the kids who supposedly are to benefit from it, taking a cold, hard look at the welfare state and whether it's working or not working. Yeah, Black Lives Matter for people who advocate those reforms. Hispanic lives matter for people who advocate those reforms. Disabled lives matter for people who advocate those reforms. It's really important that the motivation you look at behind some of these laws is revealed, because it's the same thing. It's people trying to help improve a nasty situation. We've tried 50 plus years, certain style of government intervention to fix this. And you tell me where you see evidence that these policies have worked. They've been a disaster. They've failed people. People's lives have been destroyed. So if you want to fix things, if you want to help black lives, Hispanic lives, and so on, pursue some of these policies, give it a fair shot. Don't run ads demonizing people whose hearts are in the right place and want to fix this stuff. And it's very, very important. And I think that's a missing factor in our dialogue these days, that people don't give the reformers in that side of the equation a chance to show what they're all about and to make a difference.
So I think sometimes, I'll try to take these one at a time. I think sometimes on the Black Lives Matter question, we talk past each other, because when you say all lives matter, like, yes, of course that is true, right? I don't think anyone disagrees with that. And I think it's important to say, and people, blue lives matter and some of the stuff, police being targeted. I'm for all of that. I also recognize that I think a lot of the motivation behind Black Lives Matter is saying, our lives matter just as much as anyone else's, and we don't feel like that's the way it's going in this country. And so it's sort of like, Black Lives Matter too, and look at some of these systemic problems. Look at some of the cases where, anger is whipped up against the police. I think it's unfair, and the police did not act incorrectly. But in some cases, you see some of these videos, like the kid in Cleveland, right, getting shot, and nothing comes of that. And I think it's completely reasonable for people in the black community to say, like, no, seriously, what the hell's going on here? So I think, I don't know, I agree on both sides. I'm very comfortable saying Black Lives Matter, period. I'm also very comfortable saying all lives matter, period. And I don't think these are incompatible concepts. That's point one. Point two, for all of the talk of Donald Trump and white nationalism and white identity politics and all this stuff, and some of the things he said, a few of which I outlined earlier that made me very uncomfortable, he outperformed Mitt Romney among blacks and Hispanics. I mean, the numbers were still not good, but he outperformed Romney among Hispanics. Mr. Build the Wall, Mexican rapist, like that guy, did better than Romney with Latinos. There are weird undercurrents in our politics that I don't think are easily explained. And lastly, yes, we're a panel of white dudes. That's fine. That doesn't, I think, enhance what we have to say or detract from what we have to say. I think our points should be judged on the merits of the points, not the color of our skin or the genitalia that we have. So let's take a look at our arguments and go from there. I would also point out, and this is not a shot at CWA, I love coming here, this is my 5th or 6th, but look at your program and see how many female conservatives are participants. I think the reason that we don't have one up here is because there isn't one here. So I'm not in the room, but of the speakers, I don't think that we have one this year. And I don't think that is, reason to say that our opinion is any less valuable. And I know that CWA works hard and is working hard. You talk about diversity. I think we can always improve here on that front. And I think, again, if we wanted to obsess over identity politics and say, well, whose opinion counts more or less because of their immutable characteristics, I don't like that. Bob could, play the Jew card, to put it, crudely. I could play the LGBT card. I'm gay. But I don't run around being like, hey, I'm gay, and so I'm special, and so listen to me more. No, I want people to value my thoughts and not focus on how I look or what group I identify with. So that's how I try to approach life.
Good. There are two areas. You guys choose. One, well, no. These are a collection of questions. One deals with the perception that Republicans don't care about climate change. That's one. The second one is, we've all talked about domestic policies. There are a bunch of questions of what about Trump and foreign policy? We only have about 10 minutes left. I'm not sure that we can cover both climate change and foreign policy. Who wants to address climate change? A voice vote. Okay. Both? We're going to do both? We can't do both. Climate change, foreign policy. Jeez. Oh, I don't know what to do. Let's see. Climate change. Go ahead.
Well, let me, I'll say two things. One of the scholars at the Hoover Institution posted an essay this week, I think it was David Henderson, on the models. And he looked at, he's an economist, and he looked at it from a rigorous econometric standpoint, and basically was pointing out all the range of errors, plus or minus, for all the major calculations that these models have to make, and basically lays out that the range is so broad as to be almost meaningless, okay, down the road when you're trying to project something in the year 2100, right? Conservatives tend to be, if there's anything about progressivism that we tend to highlight and are skeptical about, it's a sense that outside experts can determine our lives and know exactly how to, fashion a very, very specific kind of a solution. And that's something that applies to a model or a projection for the next 6 months, much less the next 100 and whatever years, okay, or 60 or 80 years. And so there's a skepticism that goes into some of the religious-like intensity and certainty that accompanies the projections for something in the year 2100, given models of 15, 20 years ago have been off by certain degrees already, right? But the other point, I'll just throw it on the table. Whatever I think about it doesn't matter, but I have a solution for you to allow you guys to win. And I think I may have mentioned this last year, but I'll say it again. Get rid of the 16th Amendment. You know what that is? The income tax, right? The amendment that allowed the income tax to be in existence. Get rid of it. So all those tax rates go away, and the government will have to raise its revenue from what? Consumption. What's the big form of consumption? Carbon tax. You want a carbon tax? Okay, how many people here would like a robust carbon tax? Hands up, please. Anyone here opposed to a carbon tax, by the way? Okay. What if there were zero income taxes, right? Okay. So this is a solution. You can walk hand in hand with all these right-wing, Friedman-esque, Hayek conservatives, right? Free market people, Austrian economists, into the twilight of a climate change solution, if that's what you think is going to do. You may not get them to agree on religious, theological grounds with you, but you can fashion a consumption-based form of taxation to fund the government, some of which would be carbon, to your heart's content. And the conservative economists will tell you get more economic growth out of that than any other form of taxation. So it's a win-win for different reasons.
Maybe we could address foreign policy?
One thing on climate change, I
Oh,
would
okay.
I would recommend. I believe Stephen Hayward wrote it in my view, and he's sitting right over there. He's the other Republican in the room. Also a white man though, so take this with a grain of salt. Very white male salt. But he wrote a piece 4 years ago or so. Hugh Hewitt, national radio host, he's on Meet the Press all the time. He asked a question about how should Republicans talk about these issues. This was your post, right? And he wrote a very lengthy, very thoughtful response to Hugh's question at Powerline, which is a conservative blog. You can Google this. And it was, I think, really useful to me because I'm someone who, looks at some of the scientific evidence, much of the scientific evidence, and says, okay, climate change appears to be real. It appears to be anthropogenic, caused at least in part by mankind. What ought we do about this from a public policy standpoint? And that's where things, get thorny. If you keep the current tax regime as it is and add a carbon tax, that's hugely regressive, right? That disproportionately impacts people with less disposable income, poor people, working class people. That hurts. We're tying our hands behind our back while other developing nations with billions of people aren't going to play by those rules. So how do you balance our national economic interests with the moral imperative to protect the planet in the short and long term, when China and India won't necessarily go along in a meaningful way. That's a very serious question. That doesn't mean that you're anti-science or, hate the planet or want, dirty air and water for our children. It's a very real question to ask. And then the other one is, if America did everything that you want on the left, adopted every single policy, would that make an appreciable difference scientifically in terms of the climate? And climate scientists, many of them will admit and concede, well, not really, if America did it unilaterally. That is, I think, a relevant point to bring up, as is the point that if you look at climate change and global warming, it is happening. I think that is undeniable. But the projections that we've had for years about where we would already be right now have been way, way off. So while it's a problem, and I think we ought to do something about it, some of the alarmism from the scientific community has done itself a disservice because reality, actual data, has not kept up with the projections, the hypothetical projections. So that's where some of my skepticism comes from.
Tying this into foreign policy, there's no plausible solution or at least mitigating policy for climate change without Chinese cooperation. You're not going to get it on climate change or anything else.
We have 4 minutes. I want to ask Bob Kaufman. The title of his book, again, is Dangerous Doctrine, How Obama's Grand Strategy Weakened America. Is Trump going to strengthen America?
Provisionally, the odds are decent to good, yes, because he's going to do the one most important thing to restore robust muscular deterrence in vital geopolitical regions of the world, particularly East Asia. He's going to rebuild the American military, which has been ravaged. And even if Trump's initial instincts in some respects, from my point of view, have been wrong, he will be able to recover if he does, and it looks like he has, realized that certain instincts such as Putin, that's a mistake, with a rebuilt American military than had we continued in the terrible direction that we were in under President Obama, where we were heading to have a Navy smaller than the Navy that we had in World War I before we entered the war, woefully unprepared for what was to come. So provisionally, although he is not my candidate, and it's like saying someone's the best looking person in the physics department, compared to the alternative, Trump will make us stronger than we were for the past 8 years. So that's a conditional but significant endorsement of that proposition, yes.
We are out of time. I want to thank all of you. You've been a very respectful audience. And the panelists will be outside if you want to ask further questions. Thank you very much.
So yeah, who wrote it? David Henderson and Charles Hooper, a long time. I just came out this past week.
They've been way off. Thank you so much. Thanks for coming. Thank you.